Hey everybody, this is John from Nexus MTG, doing more of our burn month here, doing the burn versus blue-white control matchup in Modern. As a friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. Also, don't forget to join our Discord, where I'm setting up various different things, but mainly we're talking about burn and other stuff right now. We'll also be talking about other decks of the month as they go along, and any other topics you want to discuss in the general chat. Welcome to join our Discord channel. So, blue-white control versus burn. The key cards in the matchup from the burn side, example of burn lists that are running around right now. 4 copies of Cindervine on the sideboard. I really like this particular build. This is the build we've been running on the channel. 4 Cindervines has proven to be really good, and in this particular matchup, it happens to be pretty decent. I'm still holding on to old tech of Exquisite Firecraft, which gives me a little more game in some of these controlling matchups, but a lot of decks are not running this, so it's a card that I don't even really discuss too much. In the key sideboard cards, beyond that, you got things like Skullcrack and such on the sideboard. And then, just your usual Monster, Swift Spirit, Goblin Guide, Eidolon, and the Great Rebel. Skewer the Critics decks. As far as blue-white control is undergoing some interesting changes right now. So a lot of the stuff from War of the Spark, things like Teferi Time Raveler, Narset, Dovin's Veto, are kind of impacting how these blue-white Miracles lists are being run right now. Some lists are running like 2 Teferi, 2 Jace, 2 Teferi Hero Dominaria. Some lists are back to running copies of Entreat the Angels, so a lot of interesting changes going on. Also, an interesting one against Burn when they have a lot of 1-drops, Blast Zone. So, a lot of interesting tools for the blue-white X decks in the format. We're particularly concentrating on blue-white because I think Jeskai and Esper have different cards in them that change the matchup, and blue-white has kind of become the kind of staple in terms of what deck is seeing play right now. And then, obviously, Timely Reinforcements here is pretty good against Burn. Logic Knot and Counterspells are pretty reasonable in the face of the new Neoform combo deck that's kind of running around, so kind of necessary even along with Path to Exile. So from the Burn side, key cards are the creatures. You got to get on the board early and play from ahead. Goblin Guides, Swift Spears, Eidolons, any of those cards can kind of be key here, especially the deck that lacks a tremendous amount of spot removal. They have like Path to Exiles, Condemns. That's about it in the main deck, so they're often have to rely on sweepers to deal with creatures. So if you get on the board early, force them to deal with that, gives you openings to bob and weave with your burn spells to kill them. Key sideboard cards, things like Skullcrack, things like Cindervine. In the list that I still particularly want run, something like Exquisite Firecraft is obviously reasonable against a deck that's going to be trying to win, basically with a bunch of counter spells. So, it's pretty much what you're trying to do. You're trying to get Cindervines and Eidolon into play, force your opponent to play spells into that, get them low, burn them out, bob and weave around their counter spells. So, Burn's game plan, not really too exciting here. Both game 1 and post board, get on the board early, force them to react to what you're trying to do. Especially with the copies of Cindervines in play, they're taking damage from the various spells they're casting. And as far as finishing off the game, you tend to want to overload their mana in game 1. Get into a situation where, say, either they tap out for a threat, or tap low for like a Jace or Teferi, or a Vendilion click or something. Otherwise, what you need to do is you need to overload them to the point where they'll die in one turn cycle. Basically, you wait until their end of turn, cast Boros Charms, cast Lightning Helixes, cast Lightning Bolts, that kind of stuff. Force them to react to that, and then during your next turn phase, cast all your Sorcery Speed stuff, all of your, your Lava Spikes, your Skewer the Critics. This plan gets a little bit weaker now that we're playing Skewer the Critics in terms of having more instant speed spells, but generally that's the game plan you're trying to work around. In game 2 and 3, the key depends on how many copies of Skullcrack you have. Once again, you need to learn to play around their counter spells, try to overload their mana, but you also need to try to have a Skullcrack up for a turn through Timely Reinforcements. Have a Skullcrack up when they try to attack with one of either a Baneslayer Angel or a Lyra Dawnbringer if they're still packing those on the sideboard. And then, no, they're going to have a lot more um, counter spells in the game 2 and game 3. Things like Dispel, things like Negate, things like Mana Leak potentially, things like Logic Knot, things like Dovin's Veto. There's going to be a lot more counter spells in game 2 and game 3, and they also bring in things like Celestial Purge, so they're not as reliant on their sweepers to deal with your creatures. So game 2 and game 3 get a lot tougher, but I still think overall the matchup's pretty favorable. You have some pretty good tools on the sideboard, things like Cindervine, things like Skullcrack. If you really think or know for sure they're on the Angel plan, you could potentially bring in Path, but that is a very slippery slope to try to answer their 1 or 2 of threat, because oftentimes they can easily close you out with a Planeswalker or something. Something to note is Teferi Time Raveler, if they do leave that in the matchup, makes things a little bit more complicated, because that means you only can play at sorcery speed, so basically you have your turn, and then the upkeep, draw step, and main phase until they activate Teferi. So that gives you a little less windows to play your instant speed stuff, to overload their mana and such. So keep that in mind. If they do drop Teferi, Time Raveler, you have to kind of alter your play patterns a little bit. Like Teferi into Timely Reinforcements could be kind of a rough setup if they're able to do that, and you don't have enough of a board presence to deal with Teferi. So that is a card that I haven't had a chance to play against yet, so that is something to keep in mind, that they do have new tools to their trade, so be mindful that the matchup could change a little bit based around those tools. As far as the key blue-white cards, your key early interaction spells, your Path to Exiles, your Condemns, an early Terminus, whatever it takes to get your burn opponents' creatures off the board is generally what you want to be doing. And then you need to establish a clock. If you're not in an immediate danger of dying, something like a Teferi, a Jace, a Vendilion Click, Snapcaster Mages backed up by colonies and counter spells, you need to get a clock on your burn opponent. You cannot sit there and try to win a draw-go game against Burn. Burn is just as equipped to play a long, drawn-out land-go game if you don't have something like a Teferi or a Jason play accruing card advantage, getting a man advantage, getting a search for Azcanta going if your deck's even running that at this point. So you need to have a clock, you need to have a source of card advantage going to beat Burn. Yes, it sucks to tap low for that one turn, but a Teferi Hero of Dominaria or a Jace and either Scry or Fate Seal your opponent so they can't burn it out with one burn spell. Those are very important things to get going. If you do not establish a clock against Burn, Burn will eventually overload your mana and your counter spells and kill you. Alright, sideboard cards. Things like Timely Reinforcements, which some decks are main decking some copies, but I'm presuming primarily it's going to be on the sideboard. Your cheap counter spells, your dispels, your Dovin's Vetoes, your negates, any of that stuff comes in. Another key card that some of the blue-white lists were running for a long while were the Angels. Baneslayer, Angel, Lyra, Dawnbringer. If you have those, bring them in. They're a clock. They're a life gain. They force your opponent to react to what you're doing. So those are all key cards in the matchup, but for right now I'm representing it with Timely Reinforcements and Dispel, because those are the cards that are seeing the most play right now, but obviously lists have run the Angels, they've run multiple counter spells, anything like that, any life gain, any early interaction, Celestial Purges for their creatures. Anything you have that can interact with Burn earlier is a key. Once again, Game 1, deal with early creatures. Establish a clock. Kind of already talked about that when we're talking about the key cards in the matchup. Post board, once again, deal with early creatures. You have even more ways to do it. Path, Oust, Celestial Purge, Condemn, any of those things. Deal with their creatures. Get them off the board. Timely Reinforcements is in this category because not only is it life gain and forces them to react to what you're doing, but Timely Reinforcements also can deal with creatures. Put 2 or 3 of these in front of a Goblin guy. Put 2 or 3 of these in front of a Nylon. Put all 3 of them in front of a Monastery Swiftspear if they can't pump it up enough. Or just chump blocking your opponent's creatures. Keeps you alive. Keeps you doing what you're doing. You need to establish a clock again. Stay alive. Use your counter spells. Use your life gain. One card that some of the blue-white lists were popping up with was Absorb. It's both a counter spell and life gain. That's insane. That's basically a 2-for-1 in this matchup. Anything that keeps you alive and establishes a clock to counter race Burn, whether it be a Jace, a Teferi, one of your Angels, a Vendilion Clique, something to get going to pressure their life total. You have to close out the game against Burn. If you sit there and play a long game against Burn without any pressure on them, Burn is eventually going to draw enough burn spells to kill you. That's just the nature of the matchup. This is why decks like Esper and Jeskai are a little bit better in the burn matchup overall. I mean, obviously it depends on like the particular cards, but like without skewing the matchup, things like Lightning Helix, Lightning Bolt, Kaya. Those are things that put a clock on burn. They force burn to react. So if you're just sitting there like draw go, draw go, draw go, you're eventually going to lose as the blue-white control deck. This matchup is heavily dependent on the builds of burn and blue-white control. In general, a multi-purpose regular blue-white control deck versus a normal burn deck, I would say the burn deck is favored. Depends on how many Skullcrack effects, how many Cinder Vines the burn deck has. Also depends on how many timely reinforcements, ousts, Lyra Dawnbringers, Dispels, Dovin's Vetoes. It depends on the nature of the answers in the blue-white control deck. The blue-white control deck wants to beat burn, it can beat burn. However, I would say without semi-skewing the deck, burn is probably favored in the matchup. But I do respect that people like, especially people on the channel like Space Marine who play blue-white control, you can be burn if you want to be burn. However, Modern is such a wide open format, it's really, really hard to beat burn straight up and have enough answers to Izzet Phoenix or Dredge or Tron or, you know, this new Neoform deck. You know, that's the thing. It's one of the things about Modern is a lot of it is shifting based on what the perceived threats in the format is. It's really hard to metagame in Modern. So, a lot of it. And one other minor mention for Blue-White's plan is Field of Ruin attacking white mana sources or green mana sources for Cinder Vines can be a thing to kind of stifle what the burn deck is doing. However, if the burn player is smart, they will play around it enough to the point where that plan's not viable, but it is something that can happen. Pay attention to your opponent's mana sources and try to color screw them if you can with Field of Ruin. That can be a way to put dead cards in their hand. A lot of these lists, especially if they're on a Cinder Vines list, only play one green source. If you can tag that green source before they get a Cinder Vines down, you're going to be better off. If you can strand some amount of white cards in their hand, like Boros Charm or Lightning Helix, that can, you know, potentially blank a card or two in their deck. So, something to keep in mind as you're playing along, but obviously the matchup is extremely dependent on the build of blue-white, but in general I would say burn has an edge in this matchup. Anyways, this has been John for MTG Nexus with our breakdown of blue-white control versus burn, and we'll be continuing this on throughout the month, doing various other Modern matchups.